Hello and welcome to another SHM movie breakdown and review. And in this particular breakdown, we are discussing a 1987 classic of the monster and alien genre, Predator. Now, Predator is a film which is very easy to underestimate. It's a very popular film. It's up there with Alien in pop culture, and it's popular to like the film. And I'm not going to go against that. I also love Predator. It is one of my favourite movies. But there's something very interesting about Predator, and that is that people very easily underestimate how good a film it actually is. Because you can go into Predator seeing the cast with Schwarzenegger, Ventura, etc., know that it's about a group of soldiers and an alien having this battle, and that sounds like a pretty meat-headed plot. The kind of film which you just turn your brain off, watch the explosions happen, blood everywhere, limbs flying all over the place. Simple plot, you're there purely for the action. It could have very easily been just that, essentially a modern B-movie. But the thing about Predator is, and this really is a credit to the writing, that it's a lot cleverer than that. Now, without spoiling anything, one of the reasons why I would say Predator is so clever is because of the way the Predator acts. And people at the time, back in 1987, couldn't have fully appreciated why that was so clever, because the lore and mythology of the Predator hadn't been expanded upon at that point. But now, looking back, knowing what we do about the Predator, how important things like honour are in its culture, you can actually start to break down the film and the deaths and start to notice very interesting things about the Predator. It is far from being your typical movie monster. It's a very, very interesting character in itself. It's not just an ugly face and weapons. It's much more than that. And that is a refreshing take on the horror movie monster. Now, of the two categories which this film could be put under, horror and action, it is more leaning towards the action side of things, whereas Alien is more of a horror film. That said, the second half, particularly of the film, does gear far more towards horror, with the hunter and the hunted really coming into its own. Now, the film has an excellent cast. Pretty much the pre-Expendables. You've got Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers, Jesse Ventura, Shane Black, names which just suit this film perfectly. They are the exact kind of characters that you'd expect to see in an 80s action movie. But this film takes the concept of those unbeatable 80s action heroes and really turns it on its head. Because what would happen if you put those 80s action heroes up against something which they couldn't beat? That is essentially Predator, and that is awesome. Now, this film did very well financially. Critically, as is often the case with movies of a horror or monster-based nature, initial reviews from critics were mixed. No surprises there. But financially, it did very well. It cost around $15 million to make, made almost $100 million, and spawned numerous sequels and, of course, crossovers with Alien. It also spawned toys, comics, games, etc. But what about the breakdown? How does the film fare in terms of numbers? Well, for the story and plot, it's not the most complex of stories. I would say the story is not necessarily quite as clever as Alien. Alien itself isn't an overly complex story, but it's a little bit richer than Predator. Predator is very simple. You've got a group of elite soldiers sent in to rescue some other soldiers in a location that they can't escape easily, up against a foe which they didn't realise they'd be going up against. And that's basically the plot. So for the plot overall, I'm going to give Predator a 6, because it's certainly not a bad story. It does what it needs to with what it's got, and that's more than enough. It doesn't need to be some mind-bending story. That's just not the purpose of the film. but it's not going to win an Oscar anytime soon. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. As far as the characters and their motivations, well, I would say they're very, very good. The characters are very likeable. I would say they're even up there with The Thing in terms of how good the characters are. Their interplays with each other are brilliant. All of the characters are larger than life, and that works perfectly for this film, which is much more of a macho 80s approach than Predator, which is more of a ahead of its time kind of film. So for the characters and their motivations, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10, and that, of course, includes the Predator, which, as I mentioned earlier, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest monsters of any movie. So, an 8 out of 10 for the characters and motivations. As far as the visuals and effects, I'm going to give the film a straight-up 9, because it's brilliant. It's not necessarily perfect by today's standards, but for its time, it was remarkably good, and for two reasons in particular. One is because they didn't prematurely show the Predator. In many monster movies, the movie opens with the monster. This movie doesn't do that. Also, in many monster movies, they show all of the monster too quickly. That doesn't happen here either. You see the Predator in stages. It is gradually revealed over the course of the film, and it's only right at the end that you actually see it. Another thing is that many movie monsters rely on darkness. Now, Alien is quite a dark film, but as I mentioned in my review, the creature looks so good that it does hold up in the light as well. That cannot be said for many horror movies before and since, though. So Predator really does stand out as being brilliant in that regard, because when you see the Predator, it is by far usually in broad daylight, and it holds up brilliantly. So for the visuals and effects, including the overall look of the film, it's fantastic. It's a 9 out of 10 from me. As far as the audio and music, again, it's brilliant. It's got one of the best soundtracks of any creature or monster movie, in my opinion, and the overall sounds are fantastic. The Predator has an iconic roar, iconic sounds in general. The Predator's heat vision has an iconic sound within itself. His weapons all make iconic sounds. Pretty much every noise coming from the Predator is a pop culture reference. There are so many quotable lines in the film, and everything just sounds great in general all the way through the movie. So I'm going to give it an 8, which is very high compared to many of the other films I've featured on this channel. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment, which is of course by far the most subjective to me personally, I'm going to give the film a 10. And that's probably not too surprising, and that is of course purely down to me personally. But the great thing about Predator is a similar thing to something that I mentioned about Splinter. It's the kind of movie which isn't mentally taxing. You can think about it to whatever degree that you feel like thinking into it on a particular day when you watch the film. It doesn't age badly at all, despite the films coming out in 1987. It still looks fantastic up to this day. The characters are hugely enjoyable. The Predator is a fantastic antagonist and still one of the greatest movie monsters of all time and one of the greatest aliens of all time. And every time you watch the film, it's entertaining. It's about the journey, not just the destination with Predator, and it's a fantastic journey that the film takes you on. So I've got to give it a 10. Overall then, my tabulated score for the original 1987 Predator movie is a very respectable 4.1 out of 5, which is very high for a horror genre film, showing alongside Alien just how remarkably good these films were, not only for their time, but purely for their genre. And my overall verdict for Predator is fairly obviously, if you haven't seen this movie, definitely check it out. You don't even necessarily need to be a horror fan or a monster fan to enjoy the film. Even pure action fans will love this film. But that's it overall for my review and breakdown of the 1987 version of Predator, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.